My name is Lionel Barber. I'm the chair of the Wincott Foundation, and I'm delighted to welcome our principal guests, Sebastian Payne, the Whitehall editor of the Financial Times, and the author of a widely acclaimed book, Broken Heartlands, on that reportage about the Red Wall voters and the shift to the Conservatives, amongst many other insights about the current state of our politics. Also, an old friend from up north, Chris Deerin, who is the chair of Reform Scotland, director, and contributing editor to the news, and a very shrewd, long-standing observer of Scottish politics as well as British politics. And ne'er the two shall meet, Chris. Anyway, before we start this discussion on the topic du jour, leveling up, I just want the Wincott Foundation, as you know, is dedicated to promoting quality journalism. It has several prizes, including economics and business reporting prize, a data journalism prize introduced younger prize, a regional nations prize for the best reporting out of Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England. And these awards will be seeking submissions at the end of this month, with a view to judging early next year. Okay, so to begin, every now and then, as I discovered when I was editor at the Financial Times, a journalist, we've got a whole dollop of luck tonight, because the government announced today its plans for a multi-billion investment in the rail network built around HS2, and there's quite a lot of controversy there, not least because this rail investment program is central to the agenda of levelling up. So I'm going to begin with Sebastian, and ask him, now, is this rail investment fundamentally flawed, or is it in fact, although somewhat scaled back, it's still a very important program for linking north to south and will benefit lots of consumers in the northern region? You need to unmute.
Sorry, that is such a basic error. How did I not know that after 2 years of doing Zoom things? But thank you very much, Lionel, and thank you very much, everyone at the Wincott Foundation, for having for this event as well. So this plan is £100 billion. On the one hand, it is the single biggest investment in the UK railways in its history in one lump. It includes 3 new high-speed rail lines, as well as hundreds of projects across the UK to reverse the beaching cuts that happened in the 1960s and build lots of new railways. But as you said, Lionel, there are 2 key things here missing. Number one is the eastern leg of High Speed 2 that's been backed by the last 4 prime ministers, all the regional leaders, all the businesses in the area, and is a very crucial thing. But second of all, and far more problematic, is the Northern Powerhouse Rail, which was a project brought up by George Osborne when he was Chancellor, to do a new rail line from Manchester to Leeds and going through the Pennines, which is a particularly slow and difficult rail route. Now, that is only going to have a very small stretch of new railway. The rest of it is repurposing stuff that's already there. That has gone down very badly with regional leaders. And when you listen to Boris Johnson's response today, he's aware of what he's done. He's prioritised the now to get projects going in the ground, hopefully by the time the next election, instead of that longer term reform, which we kind of need. So I think you can see either ways. On the whole, I think it's a good thing this money's being spent, that the railways do need this. Most of Britain's railways were built in the Victorian era. They're creaking, they're full of capacity, and they're really struggling at the moment. But on the other hand, it is a big shame that we could have done some immediate stuff, which is good and no doubt helpful to Boris Johnson's electoral prospects, but also that's much longer term stuff, because by the time we get to the 2040s, which seems a long time away, but that's when the second leg of High Speed 2 would have been done going up to Leeds, I absolutely bet you we wish that we had done it at this stage and not cancelled it. Okay,
so don't come too close to the microphone, Sebastian, because you're breaking up a little bit, but don't worry. Now, I want to say that, you know, Sebastian is a rail enthusiast, and he knows he spent a lot of time on platforms as well as in his red car going around the red wall constituencies. So he can answer this question. Why is it that the East-West network has been shortchanged rather than the Birmingham to Manchester, which has been turbocharged?
It's a very good question, Lionel. And when you look at that rail line going from Leeds to Manchester, it was going to go through the Pennines with a new station at Bradford and then ending up at Leeds. But it's very expensive to build a big tunnel through the Pennines to do a high-speed railway. But the cost of doing that whole line would only have been an extra £5 billion. Now, £5 billion on its own is a large sum of money, but when you're spending £100 billion on this whole thing, then you have to say, why was that saved? Why didn't they just spend that money and do that? So I think that that was a big mistake by government, and I think they will come to regret it, but I think it was expediency to try and get things going in the ground now, as opposed to bigger, longer term projects, because that new East-West rail line is taking an awful long time to build.
Well, but Boris Johnson wanted to build a bridge from Britain to Northern Ireland. So what's the problem with a tunnel just through the Pennines?
It's capacity, and it's about what you can do the here and now, because like, you have to look at this through the next election in 2024, when we expect to go back to the polls. The Prime Minister wants to say to people, we have leveled up by giving people a tangible difference in their lives. Maybe it's new hanging baskets or beautified town centres, combined with the start of this longer term infrastructure projects, things like these little small scale railway projects. But I think that's why I think they've gone small now. But there is a lot of bafflement. I don't fully understand it because of the sums of money. It doesn't really make sense to shortchange it. And some people speculate maybe it could be the fact that the Northern Powerhouse Rail and that new East-West link was in fact the idea of George Osborne, who is something of a political nemesis of Boris Johnson. And I think the fact that maybe he didn't go for this might say more about their relationship than what is right about the railways.
I can't believe that British politics is so petty, Sebastian.
I bet you can, Lionel.
Before we turn to Chris, one last question. You don't detect the hand of Rishi Sunak here?
I do, because the Treasury as well has always been very sceptical of High Speed 2 right from the beginning, and they don't like big grandiose ideas. And look at the cost of High Speed 2. You know, when I first started writing about this a decade ago, when I worked at The Spectator, it was going to cost £18 billion. I think the bill, even without that second leg, is going to be almost £100 billion at this point. So I'm sure the Treasury said, look, this doesn't make economic sense. And the Treasury's argument has been is in the post-COVID environment, people are not going to be travelling as much. They're going to be working from home more. And the case for that Birmingham to Leeds leg doesn't make sense. Now, I can see that argument, but the problem is the whole business case for High Speed 2 was predicated on that eastern leg. If you ran High Speed 2 now without that eastern leg, there is no way the National Audit Office would say it would make any kind of sense whatsoever. So I think a lot of factors have come together. Rishi Sunak, the fact that Boris Johnson gets pushed either way by the people inside government to result with what I think is a decision that maybe makes sense now, but one that we will regret in decades to come.
Turn to Chris. It must be a little bit baffling listening to this debate, or even looking at the map, because levelling up doesn't seem to extend north of the border, or am I missing something?
Well, I'm not sure it exists particularly south of the border. Actually, it seems very much to me like a slogan aimed at the Red Wall that they're now desperately seeking policies and projects to fill. I mean, obviously HS2 long predates the levelling up slogan, and you know, for what it's worth, I wonder how much of what's happened today is about the fact that Boris Johnson is desperate for short-term good news, and that he's the kind of inconstant and legacy-driven Prime Minister who wants to see things happen quickly and get the glory for them, rather than in a long line of British politicians and Prime Ministers who are dreadful at long-term planning. We've seen it on energy, we've seen it on transport for decades and decades, but they won't take these big long-term decisions because they know they ultimately won't get the credit for it, because they'll be long gone when they are. So, you know, my view of Boris Johnson, which is shared by a large majority of my fellow Scots, is that we shouldn't be particularly surprised if levelling up doesn't amount to a great deal, because the kind of constancy and durability and sacrifice that would be required to deliver it flies in the face of the kind of character that we've seen from Boris Johnson so far.
Again, I'm going to broaden this debate out in a minute, but I have to, Chris, I have to recount a conversation I had with an astute American political analyst just a couple of weeks before the COP26 summit. I think everybody was in Glasgow, but anyway, the political consultant said, I don't know why the British government, the UK government in London, doesn't do something spectacular ahead of COP26, like announcing plans for a new plant, tackling the energy gap, and other couple of really spectacular foreign investments, which would steal the thunder from the Mrs. Nicola Sturgeon. So what's going on? I mean, are they a Nicola Sturgeon, or is Scotland sort of out of reach for the Tories?
It's a discussion and a conversation that's been going on in Number 10 and in the Scotland office for many years now, really since the SNP rose to power in Scotland, without finding a satisfactory solution. So the SNP have huge control in Scotland. They've obviously controlled the government for the last 14 years, the devolved government. They control many of the institutions in Scotland now. They've put their people in place there. They control the culture around Scotland, the nature of the political debate. Everything is seen through the prism of the Constitution. And you have the Tories up here who have very much aligned themselves as the party of a no vote to independence, and the SNP is the party of yes, and that's allowed the Tories to move into second place up here. But even there, the antipathy towards the Conservatives in Scotland still stems as a hangover almost from the Thatcher years, even though that's 30 years ago now since she left office. And it's very hard for the Conservatives, even are they to adopt more of a one nation approach, to make a huge impact on voters who are maybe even in the sort of centre-left ground, where probably the majority of Scottish voters are. So what the British government has been doing up here is, and this is where it comes into contact with the levelling up agenda. The British government is spending money in Scotland, including in devolved areas, on infrastructure projects where it can put a Union Jack on the project, and it hopes that Scottish voters will see the benefits of central British government spending in Scotland. So there's all sorts of projects that they bypass the SNP to deliver, working with collaborations between councils and that kind of thing. So it might be about schools, or it might be about road building, that kind of thing. Will that work? I think the problem they have is that people in Scotland aren't necessarily looking to the British government to do that. I think people are looking to the British government to be a government that chimes with the values of Scottish voters in doing the things British governments are supposed to do. So foreign affairs, the choices that the Treasury makes, defence, that welfare, that kind of thing. And you know, I would say it's difficult to view what this Tory government's doing as something that will chime with the majority of Scottish voters. So they are spending money up here. They're obviously using a lot of the money that's coming back from European funds after Brexit, the Shared Prosperity Fund, to fund a lot of this levelling up stuff. The problem in Scotland, again, is that money from used to go from the EU to the Scottish Parliament. So Holyrood and the Scottish Government would decide where that money went. There's been a big row up here because that money is now being spent centrally by the British government, which is what they're using to fund a lot of these infrastructure projects. So in a sense, all it's doing is kindling under the debate rather than solving anything, I think, at the moment. I mean, it remains to be seen how that plays out, but my instinct is, given the scale of the money being spent, is not particularly large in Scotland. It's not really what Scots are looking for from central government, that it won't have a huge impact in terms of certainly voter behaviour up here.
Chris, the way you describe the degree of control over almost every aspect of life in Scotland, it sounds a bit like a one-party state. Is that right?
That's quite a loaded phrase, isn't it? And I've used
it's
that
deliberately before. Loaded.
Yeah. I've used it before, Lionel, and got myself into trouble. I don't think it's a one-party state because, you know, there are free and fair elections, and Labour and the Conservatives and the Greens and others stand for election. It's just that the SNP keeps on bloody winning. You know, they've been in power for 14 years. They're still 20 points ahead in the polls, and that's never really changed over the entire period they're in government. I think the reason being, one, that Alex Salmond and now Nicola Sturgeon are the two outstanding Scottish politicians, certainly in Edinburgh terms. And two, they very successfully say they will go to London and stand up to the Tories while they're down there, and that even voters who maybe don't want independence, and it is split around 50-50 at the moment, although there is a smaller, you know, that only a minority would like to see a referendum in the very near future, so that's a different argument. But they're quite happy in a way to send the SNP to Westminster and to stand up for Scotland. You know, the Labour Party has obviously been in a strange place both down south and up here, and the Conservatives up here are linked through the government down there. So the SNP, in a sense, have been the obvious option for people to choose. And like any party, if you're in power for that long, you know, and they'll probably be in power for 2 decades at least, you do start to unpick those cultural institutions and the quangos and the rest of it, and get shot of the people that the other guys had, and start to put your own people in place.
Okay. Thank you very much for answering that question directly. Having started my career in Scotland, I'm aware of the loaded term, and also actually what happened under Margaret Thatcher with the manufacturing, the close of the mines and stuff. It took some while to come through, but it did. Anyway, Sebastian, let's turn to another central plank of the government's levelling up agenda, and that is the notion that the net zero agenda will torrent of new, particularly in the new unpick, explain the thinking and also give us some assessment of how realistic that is.
So when I went on the journey for my book that you kindly mentioned, Lionel, I spent a lot of time in Grimsby, which of course most people would think of as the fish town. Obviously was the biggest fishing port in the world, and there was a time when you could literally go from one side of the dock to another by jumping from boat to boat, and you would have tens of thousands of people employed in that industry. And I went to the Grimsby fish market. This was just after the Brexit deal was signed in January earlier this year, and it was dead. You know, it's all a fish processing plant now, and it's not really coming back. And in fact, it's probably going to get worse because of the government's Brexit deal. But you go to the other side of Grimsby, and everyone is very enthused about green energy. There are about 4 wind farms out there. There's going to be another 3 built, and when the whole thing is built on Dogger Bank, it is going to be the world's biggest wind farm. Now, on that example, that's run by Ørsted, which is a European company that invested very early on with their operations management base. They employ, I think it's about 1,000 people. And on the one hand, you can say there's 1,000 really good high-skilled jobs that are blue collar and they're very stable and they're only going to grow. On the other hand, there were about 40,000 fishermen lost their jobs in Grimsby since we joined the EU. So there are new jobs from green energy. They are emerging, but they are so much smaller in scale. Now, if we are going to hit our renewable energy targets set out by the government's net zero strategy by 2050, there will be 69,000 jobs in renewable energy in total. And at the moment, there's about 20,000. So that's a lot of job creation in a lot of places. Now, to your point about the government strategy on this, Boris Johnson has latched onto this green agenda, and as I'm sure those will have read his writings over the years, he's quite a late convert to the fact that man-made climate change exists and the fact that that this is a real threat the government needs to deal with. But he sees it he sees it as a way of re-industrializing these places, that the areas that lost their industries. You mentioned the mines and the manufacturing that was destroyed during the Thatcher years. Green energy is in fact a way that can bring some of these jobs back, and I think the most potent example of it is probably Teesside, and they've got a very dynamic mayor who was elected there, sometimes using some quite controversial practices, but he has managed to create a free port in the Tees Valley, which of course was mining, steel, chemicals, heavy manufacturing, and nearly every single one of those industries has been decimated, is much smaller than it was in its prime. Now, in there, when Teesside was given free port status, GE announced they were going to build a wind turbine factory, bring 1,000 jobs there. Plus, they are bringing a carbon capture scheme, which is getting £180 from central government there. So it's little bits, but those little bits can all add up to be something quite substantial. The question is, for me on all this, is the private sector investment, because the government's putting a lot of money in. And I think one example of this is the new British Volt battery power plant in Blythe Valley, which if it goes off, that will create 4,000 jobs, again, in a part of the world that was very reliant on mining and manufacturing. But you know, how sustainable is that British Volt plant going to be? Who are the customers? Where is the private sector money coming from? You know, I've heard from some people at the Treasury saying, well, this is a great idea, but is it going to be sustainable? And I think that's what we've got to be careful of here, that through levelling up, you pour money at potential white elephants just to create jobs for short-term electoral wins without having that sustainable basis. And if you looked at what Michael Heseltine did with the Docklands in London and Liverpool in the late 1980s, that's how you do it, to get public-private partnerships that create a sustainable economic base for the future, not just throwing money at projects to win you the next election. I think that tension is what we're going to see come the white paper that's due later, before Christmas, in fact.
Doesn't the back plant link into Nissan in Sunderland? Isn't there a sort of, this is the new chapter for the car industry?
Well, it is, but that particular example I gave you, the British Volt plant, is nothing to do with Nissan. Nissan is creating its own battery plant for its own needs, and Jaguar Land Rover is doing the same thing in the West Midlands as well, for its big plant there. So it's this lack of strategy. And, you know, Lionel, I can remember when we worked together writing editorials about industrial strategy, and this is, of course, something that Britain has struggled with for decades, about how much of a planned economy do you want and how far do you go in. And I've read countless documents this over the years, and there's a constant push and pull between allowing the private sector to do some things and the government intervening. And the most significant thing that's actually happened on levelling up so far came out of the Treasury, which was they have this thing called the Green Book, which defines where business investment goes and what defines value for money in the state projects. And it's become a self-fulfilling cycle that all money goes into London, the southeast, because you get a really good return on investment. You've got a great skills workforce. It's an attractive place to live, but that means it just becomes cyclical, and that's how we've ended up in a situation where a third of British GDP is based in London and the southeast. Now, the Treasury Green Book has been ripped up. That's one thing Rishi Sunak has done. It's been replaced, that when you're looking to invest projects, you look at the wider fabric of society, the wider business investment, and bit by bit over time, that should avoid government putting money just into London, the southeast. But I do worry in some of the places I've been over the past couple of weeks that we will just invest in places that the government sort of thinks is electorally helpful, but isn't sustainable in the longer term. And it's the effect of agglomeration, I think, is the word they use.
Everything was going very well, Sebastian. Use that word. Let's crack you. Moving back to Chris. What about the other angle on job creation, that a lot of these households in the north have poor insulation, and so as part of net zero, all the dosh is going to go in these houses, because that's where you're going to change. This will be government driven, government sponsored. Is that? Am I reading that?
I do think that. I think that's a good point, and I
Chris, come in. Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
So I spoke to Susan Aiken, who's the leader of Glasgow City Council, just before COP actually. She's put in a lot of work over the last year to 18 months trying to put Glasgow on the world stage along the bigger cities in the States and San Francisco and those kind of places, in terms of inward investment and in terms of people taking Glasgow seriously as a destination for both companies and employees. And one of the things she was talking about was, Glasgow has a very, very old housing stock, drafty old, closes and big old rooms from the eras of the tea barons and the tobacco barons and that kind of thing. So they're very grand to look at, but they're freezing and they leak heat. And her point was that they're going to have to spend something like £7 billion to retrofit the boilers of Glasgow housing stock. And she's an SNP councillor, so I took great pleasure in finally getting her to admit what she needed was the British government to go and borrow that money to put it up for Glasgow. But I mean, that is only Glasgow, and you then have every other city in Britain, and the figures become eye-watering very quickly. So I think Seb's point about investment and job creation and the private sector getting involved in this kind of stuff and finding ways to make money out of it is absolutely central. But Scotland has a big problem here, because levelling up isn't just an English situation. Scotland is full of consequences of, Edinburgh is now so far ahead of the rest of Scotland. It's kind of become the London of Scotland now. It's GVA, I think in 2019 per head. So it's gross value added, how much it contributes to the broader economy, was £46,000 per person compared to a British average of 26,000. East Ayrshire and North Ayrshire was £16,000. And because of Edinburgh's, world-class university, because it's got its financial sector and the rest of it, when you look at the stats, Edinburgh is always very, very far ahead of everywhere else. And whether it's life expectancy, where your average man in Glasgow will probably live 78 years. And if you want a healthy, sorry, actually less than that, 73 years, and healthy life expectancy is down at 55 years, which is awful. The Eastern Berkshire next door, you'll get
shocking
70 years of healthy life, whereas in Glasgow you'll get just under 55 years of age. So you have these kind of qualitative differences in life. You also have obviously huge qualitative differences in terms of the jobs that are available. There are still parts in the west of Scotland, probably still hungover from the loss of the industrial sectors, whether it's steel or shipbuilding or whatever, where the state is still well over 50% of the job provision in these places. And then you'll go to Edinburgh and you'll find that the private sector is absolutely thriving. So there's an awful lot that needs done. And my view of all this, and it applies also to south of the border, is that the way to deliver levelling up to whatever level we can do it is through localism. I don't believe it can be done from Whitehall, and I don't believe it can be done by governments intervening and saying we need to do it here, we need to do it there. It is going to be delivered by people like Andy Burnham and people like Andy Street and Houchin and others like that, who need to be properly empowered to do it, who can set out plans and be, who have a better understanding really of what the stresses and challenges and opportunities are in their area. It can be super accountable to their populations, and also act as that lightning rod for debate, which you don't get if you're in London and you're trying to debate what should happen in Manchester. The problem we have in Scotland is that we don't have anything like a directly elected mayor anywhere in Scotland. What we have is probably the most centralised, ironically given devolution, we have the most centralised nation in the European Union. Because we have, well, we're not in the European Union anymore, but we were, because everything is controlled from Holyrood. Power was devolved to Holyrood and it stopped there. So councils have almost no fiscal power whatsoever. Susan Aiken, who's an SNP councillor, as I said, leads Glasgow, said to me she would like to see the Glasgow Council be given a general fiscal power. So, for example, Edinburgh wants to bring in a tourism tax. That would also be good for a place like the Highlands. Glasgow would like to bring in congestion charging in its city centre, the ability to tax land banking because it's an estate, and a lot of there are gap sites still, and the infrastructure's peeling and the rest of it. But everything is controlled by the SNP at the centre. I think in part because they don't want any conflicting narratives to spring up from maybe Conservative or Labour-run councils around Scotland. They're determined to hold on to the story of Scotland moving relentlessly towards independence. So the Scottish argument on levelling up is every bit as important as the one taking place down south. The gaps between different communities, and we're talking about green energy. Aberdeen is going through a revolution at the moment, having obviously been one of the most successful places in Britain. As you'll know, Lionel, now the oil companies are either spending lots of money in decommissioning or are transitioning into to renewable energy. And there are lots of jobs being lost up there, lots of very good, very technical jobs being lost up there. And I don't really think that that's something that can be run from Edinburgh, you know, and it's and neither is the Highlands and neither is the Borders and whatever. But because of everything I said about the political narrative up here, everything through the Constitution, they will not empower local communities and figureheads to take the hard decisions that need to be done and be held accountable for it, because they don't want to lose control.
So, Chris, could I was going to ask, could I ask Chris a question there? About this mayoral model, because obviously it works very well for England when you've got clear conurbations, be it Greater Manchester, the West Midlands, all that kind of stuff. How well would that translate to Scotland, though? Because obviously you mentioned Edinburgh, and you've got Glasgow, and then you've got, I guess, Aberdeen and Dundee. You've got those great cities, but Scotland outside that central belt is so rural and sparsely populated. How well would that translate if you try to implement that?
Well, that's a good point, Seb, and I think it is fair to say that you might want to look at different models for different types of community. But, you know, Highland Council currently covers probably the largest landmass of any council in the UK. And, you know, conceivably a figurehead there could address what's going on in the Highlands, if not perfectly, certainly better than Nicola Sturgeon can do from Edinburgh or Boris Johnson can do from London. We also have a lot of our you'll know the geography of Scotland. A lot of our cities have a lot of rural area around them as well, that are already part of the council area that they're in. So, you know, as you said, you've got Glasgow, Edinburgh, you've got Dundee, you've got Aberdeen, you've got Perth, you've got Stirling, you know, you've got the border areas, that kind of thing. Undoubtedly, you know, that thing that if you were to ask most people in Scotland the name of their council leader, including those in Glasgow and Edinburgh, the two biggest cities, they wouldn't be able to give you an answer, which tells you something about the state of local politics up here, because those people aren't seen as being important. And that's why I think, you know, everything we've had since lockdown, the rediscovery of our own communities, because we've been working from home, so many of us out walking about, using local facilities more even now and into the future because we're working from home. I think we're all invested more in our communities than we were, and it feels to me like an opportunity to really rebirth local democracy, but in a very serious and empowered way that allows us to make the decisions about our communities rather than relying on what's going on centrally. And if they want to try and bring in a tax, whether it's a tourism tax or whatever, a congestion charge, they have to put it to voters, and then they're held accountable for the success or failure of it. But that's my worry about levelling up, is that it'll be done from the centre, and we know that the centre, you know, Britain's far too centralised as it is, and actually what you need is to empower communities, because they know what the weaknesses and the opportunities are.
Yeah, so if I was an editor in Scotland, I'd definitely feel a column coming on. The title would be "Bring Devolution to Scotland." Real devolution.
I've written it a few times already, I'm afraid. There's always another way.
Just there's always is. It's called, by the way, it's called environmentally sensitive journalism, recycling, recycling columns. But before we go to some questions, maybe some questions from the audience, I just want to come back in to something you said earlier, which is so shocking. It is such a reflection of the public health crisis that 40 years plus on from when I was in Scotland, and I did a stint in Glasgow, that what you said, that basically that, you know, the age of expectancy is sort of 70, and you're not going to be pretty healthy by 55. I mean, just in a few sentences, can you explain, A, why is it that there's such endemic socio-economic decay, and B, why this government that's been in power for 14 years hasn't done anything about it?
Well, you know, you can go back a long way to trace the roots of Scotland's public health crisis, obviously, in terms of poverty going back centuries, if not decades. But let's talk about the devolution era, because we've had 20 plus years of it now. So there aren't any excuses for the politicians who've been running Scotland in the 21st century. And interestingly, Jack McConnell, who was the last Labour First Minister, who was probably a better First Minister than I gave him credit for at the time, has given an interview this week where he got quite emotional about the failures of devolution. And I agree with his analysis. I've talked to him about it a lot. And I think the situation is that the constitutional debate has been so dominant in Scotland, certainly since the run-up to 2014, the independence referendum, and ever since then, but even before that, that we've had a nationalist government that I would say nothing about how much they care about Scots in Scotland. They are very passionate about it, but they have one overriding purpose, which is to take Scotland out of the UK. To take Scotland out of the UK, they need to win a second referendum. To win a second referendum, they need coalitions of support that involve people across Scotland who might be teachers, or they might be doctors, members of teaching unions, members of health unions, people who work in the public sector. What that means is that where our public services need reformed, and they do, we are miles, we didn't go through the major reforms. We didn't go through the Blair reforms, and we certainly haven't gone through anything that happened under Cameron or since. So our education system is heavily unreformed, as is our health system, and our economy hasn't really taken many of the shocks that we've seen elsewhere. And because to do that, to make those reforms, you have to challenge the vested interests in all of these professions and the rest. You have to challenge the teaching unions if you want to make schools better. You can't do it by holding their hand. You can't do it just by waving a wand. Tony Blair's thing about the scars on his back from taking on the public sector unions. So our public, if you're a kid in the East End of Glasgow attending a fairly trappy school, your life chances today are no better than they were when the Scottish Parliament was being set up. And the reason for that is that Scotland's spent 20 years talking about the Constitution. Everything gets subsumed to that. I run a think tank, and it's very hard to make any impact on the education system or the health system, to talk to people about policy, to ask people to look again at a system that is really still in the hands of the vested interests who, as all vested interests do, bat away any criticism or suggestion that we might not be doing these things right. And I'm sure you'll agree that the Scottish education system was once historically held up as being a thing to aspire to. I don't think anyone would do that these days, and we wouldn't in Scotland either. So, and as ever, it's the people at the bottom end of the economic table that get the worst of it because they have less choice about what to do.
All right, Chris, thank you very much. We don't have any questions yet, but there is a comment from one of our trustees, Daniel Wincott, who says that local government is weak and chaotic until that is fixed. Any suggestion of why it's not going to work, and therefore your proposal for tackling levelling up through local government. He's a bit of a party pooper, I think the technical term is, when it comes to that. Anyway, Sebastian, can I ask you? Let's just talk about broken pledges, because this is what Boris Johnson has been accused of today. Yeah. Is this playing into a bigger narrative? I know we're slightly moving levelling up, but it's very topical. And do you think there's a bit of a turning point that he's been sort of found out, and there may be a sort of shift in the mood here?
Well, I think, first of all, those places that voted Conservative for the first time in 2019, that the Prime Minister wants to level up, they didn't suddenly become Tories, these people. They voted Conservative because they felt let down by Labour, not just now, but over successive elections. And they decided that they had to try something different. And when Boris Johnson came along with a very populist style, with a very compelling campaigning style, I saw it, and the scenes you saw across that election were kind of incredible, and it was a celebrity. He managed to rally people in a way that probably no leader has done since Blair, and certainly since Nigel Farage obviously was very good at doing that in certain parts of England too. The problem is
didn't win his seat. Didn't win his seat. He
did 8 times.
I sent you there, Sebastian.
I remember 8 times.
You covered that election.
Indeed, that he failed many times, but I think the point is that Boris Johnson, is a boosterist personality. Over and over again, he makes these big, grand pledges. So, if you said we're going to get Brexit done, I think whatever your views on the Leave Remain question are, Brexit is clearly not done. We're still talking about it. Almost 6 years, getting on 6 years after the referendum. So the question is when that starts to connect with people. And I think the railway thing is such a potent, clear thing here that he said his exact words were, we will do for the North what we did for London with Crossrail, which you can see is a brand new railway. And the fact he hasn't delivered on that, I do think gives Labour purchase. One of the things that here in Westminster is so perplexing is that nothing seems to stick to the Prime Minister or this government. That time and time again, there are scandals, things that normally would be politically very damaging, and he just rides on. And I think that's because we've moved into this framing where politics is about values and it's less about competence. And this actually goes to Chris's point about the independence question, that you can throw all the statistics you want at the SNP about how they failed on health or education, and yet they still keep winning. And it's the kind of same thing with Boris Johnson as well, that you can throw all these things of policy pledges not done, things that he's messed up in government, and they still keep on going. But where I think the line has to be drawn is about that question of delivering levelling up. That if people go to the polls in 2024, and they'll be a bit forgiving because of the pandemic, but if they don't feel, A, they feel better off and richer than they did 5 years ago, which is the test for any political leader going to election, but B, they can't have the perception of change in their places. Now, obviously, the government's building 8 new hospitals and extending, I think, another 32 existing ones. You've got all these new railway projects, you've got all these kind of things. And in the Towns Fund, in the budget, they announced £17 billion worth of small-scale infrastructure projects across the country. So you add all that together, and that does turn to quite a lot. And you could see how people say, well, actually, yes, Boris is chaotic. Yes, he's messy. Yes, I'm fed up of hearing about his private life. But my life feels better than it did before. And he's promising to do even more of that. And I think that fundamentally is where the power of levelling up can lie, but it requires a lot of competence, which I think it's fair to say we've not seen a huge amount from this government, but it also relies on coming back to the comment earlier about local government, because you cannot do this from Whitehall. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of small-scale infrastructure projects across the country. And in the areas where you've got combined authorities, they have the strategic capacity and accountability to do that. So Andy Burnham, for example, has got the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. He's got a big electoral mandate. He asked for £1 billion from the government for transport spending, and I think, much to his surprise as well, he got that £1 billion. That's fine. 2 weeks ago, I went up to Workington in the Lake District, which of course was the symbol of Workington Man, which was used by a think tank to capture the kind of first-time Tory voter. The capital spend of their local council there is £3 million a year. They've just been given £23 million to spend on levelling up. Do they know how to spend it? Do they know how, who's going to check that? How's it going to be spent well? And if you replicate that across the whole country, there's a real danger that actually levelling up could end up in a lot of stuff that doesn't actually change people's lives. Okay. And that's a problem for Boris Johnson.
Okay, question from Richard Deerin, which is I'm just going to take another look at it. How do issues of intergenerational fairness, like the housing crisis, play into levelling up? Who wants to take a crack at that? Chris?
Why don't you go, Chris, and I'll chime in after you.
Yeah, well, I mean, housing clearly in London is an issue all of its own, on a different scale from that in the rest of the UK. Although, it has to be said, Edinburgh, for example, is not all that far off in terms of some of the costs of it. And when young people are paying rent and trying to save up for a deposit on a mortgage, it's almost impossible to do both. And I think that we can see it's not just in housing, it's also in terms of the environment. Now, I grew up in the era of the nuclear shadow, when you were taught what to do if the bomb was going to drop, and hide behind your desk as if that was going to help you. And that sense of anxiety that was just always there humming in the background during the Cold War was something that we lived with. And, it went after the fall of the Soviet Union, but it's undoubtedly the case, I think, that there is now an anxiety for young people in terms of the environment and the kind of planet that they're going to be living in. There's also the issue of the jobs market, which is, much less secure and stable. We talk about non-jobs and changing your career many times during the span of your working life. So there's not that security perhaps in going to university, coming out, getting a stable job, well-paid job, and staying there for your life. And I think just a lot of the things that we took for granted are no longer there for that generation, and they are aware of a government at Westminster in particular that is protecting older voters because they vote a lot of them, that has protected them in terms of the triple lock in the pension for a long time, even if that's changed a bit now. And it does largely govern in a way that looks after people who already have rather than those who don't have. And I think the divergence that's been built into this situation is quite dangerous. And it does deny opportunity to young people coming through. And the other thing is, of course, when you're a parent of a young person who is trying to come through, that affects you as well. If you see that they're not going to have a better standard of life than you had, and they might have a much worse standard of life than you had. And I wonder whether this generation of politicians perhaps represent the last bangings of the old, if you like, and that once we move into new generations of kids who've grown, or adults who've grown up as as part of the technological revolution, have spent their time online, have spent their time building relationships around the world, and having these debates, that you'll finally see this stuff start to change. But some of the cynicism around at the moment, I think, in politics about protecting the elderly, when there is clearly a big gap and young people are clearly aware of it and clearly worried about their future, I think is quite shaming.
Okay,
yeah, can I just
Chris.
come in? Yes, I want to come in on that, because obviously the big divide in British politics now is not class in the way it used to be, it is age. And if you look essentially the last election, the crossover point when people are more likely to vote Conservative than Labour came down from 47, but it's 45. And so really, if you're below 45, you are much, much more likely to vote Labour on any other basis, which is the opposite of where it was in the Thatcher years, that it was actually 18 to 24-year-olds and 24 to 40-year-olds who were behind Margaret Thatcher's big victories, because they were seen on the side of capitalism, free markets and the booming services economy, unlike the older generation who were still working in manual labour. I think the housing thing is a huge anxiety. My generation of 20 and 30 somethings, the only people who can seriously buy houses are those who have inherited wealth. Doing it from scratch yourself, particularly if you live in a big city, is almost impossible. And that itself creates a huge sort of almost class disparity among us, even though we all sort of think everyone is very middle class at the moment. And I do think this is going to become a big issue, because people tend to go to the right in politics when they've got stakes in society, when they're married, when they own a home, when they've got a pension. All those things tend to make you conservative. And if you don't own assets, then what's the reason for becoming conservative? And I think that's one of the reasons Boris Johnson's government is focusing so much on house building and trying to hit that target of 300,000 new builds a year, which we've not seen since Harold Macmillan was in power in the 1950s, because they know it's not just about now, it's about future generations. And Michael Heseltine, again, he saw this with the right to buy council house in the 1980s, and that created that whole generation of Conservative voters in Essex and Kent. But I think if the Conservatives don't get this right, then I think that does in the future leave a huge opportunity for Labour.
Here's another statistic for you, which is a Scottish statistic, which is that every cohort other than the over 65s has a healthy majority in favour of Scottish independence. It's just the fact that there are so many over 65s, because we have a hugely ageing population in Scotland, that's keeping Scotland in the Union at the moment. That doesn't mean there's an inevitability to independence, because people's views change as they age and the circumstances change and the rest of it. But everyone under 65, every cohort has a substantial majority in favour of independence.
And I remember reading columns about 10 years ago saying Labour doesn't need to worry. By 2020, there will be an inbuilt demographic majority for the Labour Party for the rest of time. And look how well that went for Labour. And I think you have to be very careful with saying demographics are destiny on this, because obviously as people get older, their views change and they reshape. So those people you mentioned, Chris, who are in their, say, 40s and 30s, who are not in favour of staying within the union, they might well be as they get older.
Okay, so we're coming to a close now, so I'm going to put you both on the spot by raising the question, what does, and Lindsay Jones has put it on the agenda, but I was going to too, which is, what does Keir Starmer have to do to win the next election? Can he finesse the levelling up question, or is it now owned by Boris Johnson? Start with you, Chris.
Well, Keir Starmer can't get into Downing Street without Scotland, and at the moment the SNP have something like 56 of Scotland's seats at Westminster, and they're showing no sign of giving them up yet. I think a lot of it at the moment, there are two things. One is that people finally get tired of the SNP in Scotland, and Labour are the only conceivable replacement for them in government, because the Conservatives have a ceiling of about 30% on the place. But Labour have been lost for a long, long time. So you have that issue. The other thing is, of course, that Boris Johnson explodes down south, and you know, the personal behaviour and an unusual set of values when it comes to integrity, both in public life and private life, do still have some kind of consequence, or the economy takes a hit, which it doesn't feel like it's going to. So I almost feel at the moment it doesn't really matter what Keir Starmer does. I think it matters what Boris Johnson does, and it matters what the SNP do. And Labour are going to have to get lucky to get. It'll be let's vote this lot out rather than let's vote this lot in. He's clearly not a Tony Blair, where you felt there was a momentum and a motive force pushing this superstar towards Downing Street. He doesn't have that. But I do think the Labour Party, you know, the very name represents something that barely exists now. There isn't really a Labour movement. People don't live that way anymore. Class is much less of a thing for most people in politics. And I don't think that the Labour Party has really found a role for itself. I had Tony Blair come up and do an event for me, and he said if he was in government now, he would base the entire thing around gearing Britain towards the technological revolution, re-gearing the economy, all of that kind of thing. And you know, he was quite good at winning elections, and I haven't heard anything as sort of far-reaching or as considered as that from this Labour Party.
God, I see a rebrand, the United Technology Party. Sebastian,
New Tech, New Labour, New Tech.
New Tech.
Well, I think...
What's your view, Sebastian?
The most compelling thing I've heard was actually an interview in my book with Lord Neil Kinnock, who obviously was Labour leader in the 1980s. And I spent a lovely day with him rolling through various parts of deindustrialisation and what have you. And I asked him the same question. And he talked about the language of securitisation. And this is a concept that was first put forward by Claire Ainsley, who not coincidentally is Keir Starmer's head of policy, and she wrote a book called The New Working Class. And the whole concept of securitization is to say those pillars in society that used to give you those nets, so you know, the welfare state, the trade union, the paternalistic employer, they've all gone now, and they're not coming back for the reasons that Chris said. The language of securitization would Labour be saying, we're going to give you new structures to help you feel secure in your life. So if it's economic security, you would tackle 0 hours contracts and big bosses who are abusing employment law. For environmental security, you would talk about climate change and jobs of the future. For national security, you would talk about defence and NATO and cyber security. And you can weave that narrative throughout everything to say to people, the Conservatives, they've left you on their own. Everything's your problem. We're going to let you thrive and survive, but we're here to help you and sort of push you on that way. And I think that language is quite compelling. But the issue is, and without sort of going too personal about this, is Keir Starmer, as Chris said, does not have that Blair X factor. In some ways, he's the most obvious PM Labour's had since Blair, that if you could do a cherry pick or just put him straight into Downing Street, you can picture and imagine him being PM and being okay at the job. But in terms of a campaigner and a personality, I just don't think he quite has it. And I think that's going to be Labour's problem, because they're not going up against Theresa May or conventional Tory. You're going up against Boris Johnson, who is a celebrity first and a populist and a Conservative third of all. And that is going to be a real difficulty for him, combined with all the structural stuff we've talked about as well.
Okay, so that's a great note to end on. I would just add that it's a great analysis, securitization, but it's a terrible term, not least because it's widely blamed for the global.
That's very true. I agree with that. You remember communitarianism and things like that. Labour have always been awful.
I read it out to Claire Ainsley. Yeah, but the analysis is important. I just want to thank Sebastian and Chris for being wonderful guests and giving up an hour tonight of their time. It's great to see them both. And thank you for joining the Wincott discussion. I wish you a very good evening. Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Thanks.